Continuing on our coverage of the RTX 4070 Ti, and while for the launch day we looked at the performance using the Gigabyte Gaming OC model, today we'll be drilling a little further down into the Gaming OC cooler, the thermals, power, and of course what it can do in terms of overclocking. But before we get into that, here's a quick word from this video sponsor. Hello mate, you alright? Yeah, just got all the bits from my banging new gaming PC. Just got to put it together. It's going to be so much better than yours. Oh, right. What did you get then? The latest Intel 12th gen processor, a feature-packed motherboard, and 32 gig of DDR4 memory. See? Miles ahead of yours. You realise that board needs DDR5 memory, don't you? Don't tell me you went and bought the wrong stuff. DDR4 is so 2014. I can't believe you was that stupid. What? No, you're joking. What should I get then? For me, I'd be looking at Corsair's newest Vengeance DDR5 kits, or if you're wanting that all-important RGB, then go for the Dominator Platinum RGB. Oh, you are a lifesaver, thanks, but where can I find out more? By clicking the link in the description below, of course. And you call me the stupid one. So if you've read or watched any content from me in the past, you'll know that the Gaming OC range of cards kind of hold a sweet spot for me, as it's always offered a little more in terms of performance, cooling, acoustics, all without costing much more over a reference spec card. Now, I've always seen it as kind of a great range that offers great value for money, so I'm hoping it's the same on the 4070 Ti, as it already starts on kind of a bad footing, thanks to Nvidia hyping up the price beyond what gamers are wanting to pay. It is a large card, coming in at 336mm long, 140mm high and 58mm thick, so we'll take up 2.5 slots inside your case. Altogether, it's significantly longer and taller than the Asus TUF Gaming OC card that we looked at recently, so may cause maybe some issues with installation inside your case. Whereas in terms of weight, it also comes in a bit heavier at 1,740 grams, which is 240 grams more than the TUF Gaming OC from Asus. But it's still much lighter than some of the other 40 series GPUs we've had pass through our studio recently. Now for the styling and design, Gigabyte have kept it in check, like with all Gaming OC cards, with a simplistic, albeit kind of plastic design. Now while it is predominantly black, it does have some subtle engravings which adds a bit of texture and some glossy detail to the card, just to jazz it up a little without it looking just, boring. Now there's also a small grey area where an RGB Gigabyte panel sits at the top of the card, which can obviously be controlled through Gigabyte's own software. The three large 100mm fans sit front and centre and make up part of the Windforce cooling setup, of which the outer two spin in the opposite direction to the middle fan for the very best airflow and of course to reduce turbulence. Under the unique looking fan blades are three light rings that add more RGB to the card, and while the default pattern can be a bit seizure inducing, again it can be controlled through the software or turned off completely if it's not your cup of tea. Now compared to higher end Gaming OC cards, it's definitely smaller as expected, but as mentioned it's still on the larger scale compared to other 4070 Ti's that we've looked at. Due to the length of the card, it does come with a bracket to help support it when installed horizontally, and is a proper bracket that screws in to hold the card in place, opposed to one of those kind of prop-up stands that other card manufacturers have been bundling. The top of the card gives us our first look of the large split heatsink with vapor chamber cooling, but we will look into that more as we tear down the card. There's also a small cutout area where we find a BIOS switch to change between the OC BIOS, which is set to by default, and the silent BIOS for those willing to sacrifice some speed in exchange for quieter operation. There's also a single 12VH PWR connector to provide power to the card, though two 8-pin PCI Express connectors would have sufficed. But from my understanding, this is actually a choice that Nvidia allow AIBs to make when producing their cards for the 4070 Ti. Now, being a custom card does mean custom power limits. So while the 4070 Ti does have a stock 285 watt power limit, the Gigabyte Gaming OC can be cranked up by 19%, putting it at 314 watts. The only issue I have is with the power connector and kind of how tight it is to actually get the connector in and out. Though for the average user, well, you'd only really need to do this once typically anyway. The back of the card is very much what you'd expect for a Gaming OC card, with a large backplate that spans the whole cooler, though is a little bit on the thin side, and with no thermal pads to help dissipate the heat that's underneath. There's a very large cutout area that allows heat to pass through, which is actually much bigger than most cards on the market. Now, for the I/O, there's a small amount of ventilation in the unused space, along with the standard single HDMI and triple DisplayPort connectors. To take the card apart, there's 9 screws on the back, which then allows you to remove the heatsink and the shroud from the PCB, along with 9 screws that hold the I/O bracket onto the PCB itself. Once this is removed, you'll find access to some more screws from the front side of the PCB that then help hold the backplate on, and an extra 4 screws that split the shroud and the heatsink apart if you want to take everything apart, which might be handy for cleaning, for instance. The heatsink is split between 2 large sections, which are then joined by 7 copper heat pipes, which terminate at each end of the block. They also pass by the vapor chamber, which makes direct contact with the GPU core, GDDR6X memory, and the all-important power stages. Considering the size of the card, the PCB is relatively small in the grand scheme of things, and it's pretty well laid out with a split VRM design. The GPU has a total of 10 phases, which are made by Vishay and are SiC 653 power stages that are rated for 50 amps of continuous current, while the memory, which uses the same stages, makes up a 3-phase setup. The GPU voltage phases are controlled by the UPI 9512R controller, while the 3 memory phases are managed by the UPI UP9529Q controller, which are the exact same controllers used on the Asus TUF Gaming OC card that we looked at recently. So a pretty well organised PCB and a large cooler as well, which is all pretty much what I expected based on previous Gaming OC cards. So no surprises, just good quality components. So let's take a look at how it compares to other cards. Kicking things off with Call of Duty Modern Warfare 2, and the Gigabyte card is already off to a good start, pushing ahead of the Asus TUF Gaming OC that we looked at recently, as well as pushing slightly ahead of the RTX 3090 Ti, which considering the price point of the 4070 Ti, that's pretty impressive. Cyberpunk again saw the Gigabyte 4070 Ti pushing ahead of the Asus card by around 2% in the averages and just under 6% in the 1% lows, while also sitting just behind the RTX 3090 from Zotac, which launched for a much more significant price. The trend continued in Death Stranding with the Gigabyte 4070 Ti coming in 3% faster than the Asus TUF Gaming card, while also coming in 26% faster than the RTX 3090 Ti. I know the price of the 4070 Ti gets a bad rep, but that's pretty groundbreaking overall. Then in Watch Dogs Legion, again, the Gigabyte comes out on top, albeit by a margin of just under 3% when compared to the Asus TUF Gaming OC card. But a win is a win, and that further cements its lead over the 6950 XT, while also coming in very close to the 3090 Ti. So it's clear to see what Gigabyte have done is bang on the money in terms of performance, with it consistently beating the Asus TUF Gaming OC, which actually comes in more expensive. Now, the other area that we need to look at is how the cooler handles itself under a prolonged gaming session. So we booted up F122 at 4K on max settings and put it on a constant loop. What we found was the GPU temperature sat around 62 degrees with the occasional peak up to 64 degrees. The memory junction hovered around 66 degrees with a slight jump up to 68 degrees for a second or two, while then settling back down at 66 degrees. The hotspot temperature floated between 73 and 75 degrees during our run, while our fan remained pretty consistent at just over 1400 RPM with a max power draw of 271 watts. So I said I loved the Gaming OC range of cards because it offers up some pretty respectable performance for a pretty good price, and that's exactly what we saw here in terms of the cooling performance, while remaining pretty quiet overall. That should, at least in theory, leave us with a little bit of headroom for overclocking. So we opened up MSI Afterburner, cranked the power limit up to 119% along with the temp limit to the max, and got to work. With the power limit now up from 285 watts to 340 watts, I settled on a core clock increase of 175 MHz and a memory clock increase of 550 MHz, which resulted in a core clock of 2485 MHz, boost clock of 2815 MHz, and a memory clock of 1381 MHz, or a little under 22.1 gigabit per second effective. Once our overclock was in place and the system was stable, we booted F122 back up and ran the same loop test. The GPU temperature now dropped to around 58 degrees, while the memory junction peaked at 62 degrees, which was also a little lower than before the overclock. The hotspot temperature also decreased, now sitting around the 70 degree mark, all while using 274 watts. So not much more than at stock. The big key difference now is that our fan speed has increased from 1400 RPM up to around 1815 RPM, hence our lower temperatures. This also resulted in a core clock that increased from 2865 MHz at stock in F1 to 3045 MHz. So with our newfound faster clock speed, we ran our selection of games again. And in Call of Duty, we saw just under a 5% increase in performance when overclocked compared to stock, which now puts it ahead of the 6950 XT from Sapphire in this game. Cyberpunk also saw a small increase of 4% once overclocked in the averages, while the 1% low saw a larger 8% uplift, which combined now puts the Gigabyte 4070 Ti ahead of the RTX 3090 from Zotac in this title, which again, considering the 3090 launch price, definitely puts the 4070 Ti in a better light. Death Stranding saw our largest gain of 6% when overclocked and compared to its stock performance, which now puts the 4070 Ti ahead of the 7900 XTX flagship from AMD, albeit by 1 frame per second, though the AMD card did come in with better 1% lows overall. Lastly, in Watch Dogs Legion, while the overclock did garner another 2.8% more performance overall, the 4070 Ti Gaming OC still sits just behind the 3090 Ti, a card that Nvidia claimed was behind the 4070 Ti, though that was at 1440p and not 4K, so I guess they could argue here, though the results were very similar. So before I talk about performance, I think it's safe to say that the Gaming OC card from Gigabyte was always starting this fight on the back foot, because Nvidia have put the 4070 Ti too expensive to start with. So unless Gigabyte really managed to pull something out of their backside, it was always going to kind of get a bad reception, and through no fault of their own. Now, with the 4070 Ti coming in at $799 in the US or £799 in the UK, and this being a custom card, it was always going to be more expensive. But the saving grace is that the performance is better than the Asus card we tested, and this comes in cheaper at around £925 in the UK. So you're always going to be expected to pay more for a gaming OC, but for this, I feel like you get a lot more for your money. It's not all just, smoke and mirrors. Not only does it offer slightly better performance than the competition, and also what could be argued as a reference card, though we have no basis of comparing due to no FE cards being available for this series, it just kind of paints a better picture. Now, GPU aside, and looking at the performance of the cooler itself and what Gigabyte have done, and of course the headroom we had for overclocking, it was definitely surprising. I mean, I knew it was going to be good, purely based on the sheer size of the card, but I was even a little shocked at how good. It ran cool, and more so, it ran quiet, barely topping 1400 RPM. Now, when it comes to overclocking, as I've made pretty clear time and time again, for the average gamer, overclocking is somewhat dead. But I guess today showed that there is still something left within it, as we did see some uplift in our selection of games. I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm still a firm believer that the 4070 Ti as a whole is overly expensive and needs to come down a bit. And based on consumer reception, I think it's safe to say that it likely will, as gamers aren't exactly flocking to pick one up. And with anything that's based around, supply and demand, something has to give, and to make people buy it, they're going to have to reduce the price. Money aside, the 4070 Ti Gaming OC is an amazing card. And if the 4070 Ti as a whole were to drop by $100 in the US or £100 in the UK, and then we saw the same with AIB cards, it would make this a much better proposition. It's not a bad card, but Nvidia kind of, they've ruined what could have been, but this could all change in the future. For now, while I've only looked at a couple of 4070 Ti so far, this one, it's probably my favourite. What do you think? Could it be a great card if it was just a little bit cheaper? Let me know in the comments section below. For now, hopefully you enjoyed this video. If you did, a like and a sub to the channel would be absolutely amazing. And if you love what we do, consider supporting us over on Patreon, where you'll get access to a ton of cool features, like our live Q&A sessions that are kind of specific and only for Patreons, exclusive behind the scenes content, access to our bi-weekly game night, and much more. The link for all of that is down below. Thanks for tuning in. I'll see you in the next one. See you later, guys. Bye-bye.